October 15th, 2023. Harrison Ford had kept Danny McKenzie's secret for 40 years. The real reason his best friend died on that Wyoming film set wasn't mechanical failure. It was murder. Young actor Tyler Brennan chose the wrong day to mock Danny's daughter in front of the entire crew. Called her Daddy's little safety princess when she tried to stop his reckless stunt work. The kid had no idea he'd just crossed a line 40 years in the making.
Harrison walked over to Tyler, smiled that famous crooked smile, and whispered something in his ear. Whatever he said made the cocky 25-year-old go white as Montana snow. 3 hours later, Tyler's agent dropped him. By sunset, his publicist followed. Within a week, every major studio in Hollywood had quietly blacklisted him. The crew started asking questions. How does Harrison Ford destroy a career with just a whisper? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whispers started in craft services, spreading like wildfire through the Montana base camp. Harrison Ford sat alone at his usual corner table, methodically cutting his apple into precise quarters while crew members shot nervous glances his way. In 43 years of filmmaking, he'd never seen grown professionals look so unsettled by a quiet conversation. What do you think he said to the kid? The gaffer's voice carried despite his attempt at discretion. Harrison didn't look up from his apple, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These people had no idea what they'd witnessed. Tyler Brennan's public humiliation of Sarah McKenzie wasn't just another Hollywood tantrum. It was the spark that ignited 4 decades of carefully controlled rage. Sarah herself sat 3 tables away, her father's worn leather safety manual open beside her untouched sandwich. At 38, she carried Danny's intensity in her dark eyes and his methodical precision in every safety protocol she implemented. She'd inherited more than his passion for keeping actors alive. She'd inherited his enemies, too. Though she didn't know it yet, Harrison's phone buzzed. A text from his longtime friend in studio security. Tyler's lawyers are already asking questions. Kid's scared. Good, Harrison typed back. He should be. The afternoon shoot called for a helicopter sequence over the Bitterroot Mountains. Harrison watched Sarah conduct her safety briefing with military precision, checking harnesses, reviewing emergency protocols, testing communication equipment. She was Danny reincarnated, if Danny had been born with the weight of his father's mysterious death pressing down on her shoulders. Tyler Brennan was notably absent from the briefing. Word had spread that he'd locked himself in his trailer, making frantic phone calls to anyone who might salvage his imploding career. Harrison felt a dark satisfaction at the boy's panic, but it was tempered by something more complex, a recognition that Tyler was just another pawn in a game that had been playing since 1983. Mr. Ford? Harrison turned to find Marcus Webb, the film's young director, approaching with obvious reluctance. Webb was talented but inexperienced, the kind of filmmaker who'd landed this $100 million project through equal parts skill and studio politics. We need to talk about Tyler, Webb continued, glancing around nervously. I don't know what happened between you two, but his representation is threatening to pull him from the picture. Legal says we're looking at delays that could cost. Marcus Harrison's voice carried the weight of 4 decades in Hollywood. Tyler Brennan disrespected a member of my crew, a member whose father died ensuring actors like him could play hero without actually risking their lives. The boy made his choice. Webb's face flushed. Look, I respect what you're saying, but we can't just... Can't what? Harrison stood slowly, his full height and presence filling the space between them. Can't hold people accountable for their actions? Can't expect basic human decency on a professional film set? The director took a step back. Harrison had built his reputation on being collaborative, professional, easy to work with. This cold intensity was something new, something that spoke to depths Webb couldn't fathom. The studio executives are flying in tomorrow, Webb said weakly. They want answers. Harrison smiled that same crooked smile he'd given Tyler hours earlier. Then they'll get them. As Webb retreated, Harrison's attention returned to Sarah. She was reviewing aerial footage on a tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had no idea that her father's accident had been carefully orchestrated. or that the man responsible was likely watching this very production, waiting to see if Danny's daughter would prove as inconvenient as her father had been. For 40 years, Harrison had played the long game. He'd cultivated relationships, gathered information, and slowly closed the net around the truth. He'd protected Sarah from a distance, ensuring she got the training she needed, the opportunities that would keep her safe in public view. But Tyler's attack had forced his hand, revealed the depth of his connection to the Mackenzie family. The real killer would be watching now, wondering why Harrison Ford had responded so violently to what should have been a minor on-set incident, wondering if Danny's secret had been passed to his daughter, if Sarah knew something that made her dangerous. Harrison's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he hadn't seen in 3 years, but one he'd never forgotten. He let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Marcus." Not the director. The other Marcus. The one who'd been Danny's assistant director in 1983. The one who'd disappeared from Hollywood 6 months after the accident. "Saw the news about Tyler Brennan," the voice said. "Interesting career move for someone who usually minds his own business." Harrison watched Sarah pack up her equipment, her movements efficient and unconscious. Some business becomes personal. Danny's girl is all grown up. Pretty thing. Be a shame if she inherited her father's bad luck. The line went dead. Harrison stared at his phone for a long moment, then scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. After 40 years of patient investigation, Marcus had just made his first mistake. The hunt was finally beginning. Harrison Ford stared at his phone for 30 seconds after the line went dead, the device feeling heavier in his weathered hands than it had moments before. Around him, the Montana film set continued its evening routine, grips breaking down equipment, craft services cleaning up the remnants of dinner, assistant directors coordinating tomorrow's call times. The familiar choreography of a production winding down for the night. But Harrison's attention had narrowed to a single point of focus. Marcus Volkov had just made contact after 3 years of silence. The name itself carried the weight of 4 decades. Not Marcus Webb, the earnest young director who'd approached him earlier with trembling hands and studio concerns, but Marcus Volkov, Danny Mackenzie's former assistant director, the man who'd vanished from Hollywood like smoke 6 months after the accident that killed Harrison's best friend. Harrison's thumb hovered over his contacts list, muscle memory guiding him to a number he'd programmed years ago but never called. Frank Castellano, former LAPD detective, now private security, one of the few people who knew the real scope of Harrison's investigation. Their last conversation had been 18 months ago, when a lead on Volkov's whereabouts had gone cold in Prague. But first, Sarah. He watched Danny's daughter across the base camp, her movements economical and purposeful as she secured equipment in weatherproof cases. She'd inherited her father's hands, long-fingered and precise, equally comfortable with a safety harness or a clipboard. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet authority that came from a lifetime of keeping other people alive, but Harrison could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. Tyler Brennan's public humiliation had shaken her more than she'd admit. Not because of the personal attack. Sarah Mackenzie had survived worse than an entitled actor's tantrum, but because it had happened in front of her crew. Her authority questioned, her competence mocked, her father's legacy used as ammunition for a spoiled child's rage. Harrison had known Danny for 12 years before the accident, had worked 6 films with him, had stood as best man at his wedding to Sarah's mother. They'd shared hotel rooms in remote locations, split bottles of whiskey while reviewing the next day's stunts, argued about safety protocols with the passion of men who understood that the difference between spectacular and tragic often came down to inches and seconds. Danny had been the most careful man Harrison ever knew, obsessively careful, the kind of coordinator who checked every cable twice, tested every rig personally, walked through sequences until he could anticipate problems that hadn't happened yet. The idea that he died in a freak accident with faulty equipment was like suggesting Einstein had failed basic mathematics. Harrison's investigation had started within hours of Danny's death, born from grief and disbelief and a growing certainty that someone had murdered his best friend. 40 years of following leads, cultivating sources, building a network of contacts across 3 continents. He'd learned about offshore accounts, mysterious equipment purchases, a web of connections between Volkov and certain studio executives who'd had reasons to want Danny Mackenzie silenced. The official cause of death remained equipment failure. Faulty carabiner, they'd said, metal fatigue. But Harrison had examined that carabiner himself, had paid metallurgists to analyze the fracture patterns, had slowly, methodically, built a case that would never see the inside of a courtroom because too many powerful people needed it buried. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Pretty sunset tonight. Reminds me of that evening in Moab, 1983. Some memories never fade. Harrison's blood chilled. Moab was where they'd filmed Danny's last picture, where the accident had happened, where Harrison had held his dying friend's hand and promised to watch over his daughter. Another message. Give my regards to Sarah. Harrison's thumb moved with practiced efficiency, forwarding the messages to Frank Castellano with a single word, now. Across the base camp, Sarah had finished her equipment check and was heading toward the parking area. Harrison rose from his table, his movements casual but purposeful. After 4 decades of protecting her from a distance, he was about to violate his own cardinal rule, never let her know how much danger she was in. Sarah! His voice carried clearly in the mountain air. She turned, surprised. Despite working together on 3 pictures over the past 8 years, they'd maintained professional boundaries. He was Harrison Ford, Hollywood legend. She was the safety coordinator, Danny Mackenzie's daughter, someone who'd grown up hearing stories about her father's famous friend but never quite believing they were real. Mr. Ford. Her voice carried the same careful respect she showed all the principal actors. Is everything all right? Walk with me, he said, nodding toward the path that led away from the base camp, toward the ridge where the mountain air grew thin and conversations couldn't be overheard. For a moment she hesitated. In the dying light, Harrison could see Danny's features reflected in her face, the strong jawline, the intelligent eyes, the slight crease between her eyebrows when she was thinking through a problem. Please, Harrison added, and something in his tone made her decision. They walked in silence toward the gathering darkness, Harrison's phone buzzing with Frank Castellano's response, on my way. Keep her close. The hunt that had consumed 40 years of his life was about to reach its conclusion, and Sarah Mackenzie was standing at the center of it all. The mountain path wound upward through stands of lodgepole pine, their shadows stretching long across the rocky ground as the last light faded from the western peaks. Sarah Mackenzie walked beside Harrison Ford in silence, her boots finding sure footing on terrain that had claimed more than one careless hiker. The professional distance she'd maintained for 8 years felt suddenly fragile, like safety glass under pressure. You're probably wondering why I asked you to walk with me, Harrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of words he'd rehearsed for decades but never spoken. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Sarah's response carried an echo of her father's patience, the same measured calm that had made Danny Mackenzie legendary among stunt coordinators. Though I'll admit, after today's excitement with Tyler, I'm curious. They reached a small clearing where the path leveled out, offering a view of the valley below. Base camp spread out beneath them like a constellation of work lights and equipment trailers, the familiar geometry of a film production settling in for the night. Harrison stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Your father and I had a conversation up here, he said. Different mountain, same stars. 2 nights before he died. Sarah's breath caught. In 40 years, she'd heard Harrison Ford's name mentioned countless times in stories about her father, but he'd never spoken to her directly about Danny. Their professional relationship had been built on mutual respect and careful boundaries, an understanding that some subjects were too personal for the workplace. He was worried about something, Harrison continued. Equipment irregularities, purchase orders that didn't match inventory, safety reports that had been altered after submission. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen casting pale light across his weathered features. He thought someone was setting him up to take the fall for an accident that hadn't happened yet. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd grown up with the official story. Equipment failure, metal fatigue, a tragic accident that could have happened to anyone. Her mother had never questioned it, had built a life around accepting the inexplicable loss of a man who'd made safety his religion. That's not what the investigators found, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd read those reports, had memorized every detail of her father's death the way some people studied family genealogy. The certainty she'd lived with for 4 decades was cracking like ice under spring sun. Harrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression hardened. "Read this," he said, handing her the device. The first message was time-stamped from 20 minutes ago, pretty sunset tonight. Reminds me of that evening in Moab, 1983. Some memories never fade. The second, give my regards to Sarah. Who sent these? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus Volkov, your father's assistant director on that last picture. Harrison took the phone back, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. He called me earlier tonight, right after the Tyler incident. First contact in 3 years. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, not physically, but emotionally. The careful structure of her understanding, about her father's death, about her own career choices, about the protective distance Harrison Ford had always maintained, was collapsing like a controlled demolition. "You've been investigating," she said. It wasn't a question. For 40 years. Harrison's admission carried the weight of obsession, of a promise made to a dying friend and honored across 4 decades. Your father didn't die in an accident, Sarah. He was murdered. And the man who killed him has been watching you your entire career, waiting to see if you'd become as inconvenient as he was. The phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, another message. The daughter looks just like him. Same stubborn chin. Same bad luck coming. Sarah read the words twice before their meaning fully registered. The threat wasn't historical. It was immediate, present tense, happening now. "This is about Tyler," she said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "My confrontation with him, your response. Someone's been watching, waiting for a reason to act." Harrison nodded grimly. "For 40 years, I've kept you safe by keeping distance. Professional boundaries, limited contact, letting you build your reputation without any visible connection to my investigation. But when Tyler attacked you publicly, I couldn't stay neutral. My response revealed too much. Another message appeared. Harrison's getting sentimental in his old age. Time for both Mackenzies to join Danny." Sarah stared at the screen. Her father's death suddenly recontextualized as the first move in a game that was still being played. Every safety protocol she'd mastered, every precaution she'd implemented, every instinct Danny had passed down to her. None of it had been about preventing accidents. It had been about surviving murder. "What do we do?" she asked. Harrison's phone rang. Frank Castellano's number. "We finished what your father started," Harrison said, accepting the call. "Frank, how fast can you get to Montana?" The hunt that had consumed Harrison Ford's adult life was no longer a solitary pursuit. Standing beside Danny Mackenzie's daughter under the vast Montana sky, he realized that the most dangerous phase of his 40-year investigation was just beginning. The past had returned with vengeance, and there was no going back. Frank Castellano's voice crackled through the phone's speaker, decades of cigarettes and late nights compressed into gravel. "I can be wheels up in 2 hours. What's the situation?" Harrison glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone pale in the phone's blue glow. Volkov made contact. Direct threats against Sarah. The endgame is starting. Jesus Christ. Frank's exhale was audible across the connection. "After all these years, why now?" Tyler Brennan forced my hand. I responded too aggressively, revealed the connection. Harrison watched base camp's lights twinkle below, each one representing a crew member who had no idea they were working on a film set that had become a hunting ground. "Frank, bring everything. All the files, all the evidence. It's time." The line went dead. Sarah stood motionless, her breathing shallow in the thin mountain air. Harrison had seen this reaction before. The moment when someone's reality shifted so fundamentally that their mind needed time to process the new landscape. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is insane. You're talking about a 40-year conspiracy, about my father being murdered, about someone hunting me. Do you understand how that sounds?" Harrison pocketed his phone and studied her face. Danny's stubbornness was there in the set of her jaw, the way she planted her feet when presented with information that challenged her worldview. But so was her mother's practicality. the need to examine evidence before accepting impossible conclusions. "Walk me through it," Sarah continued. "If someone wanted my father dead in 1983, why? What was he threatening? What did he know?" The wrong people were cutting corners on safety equipment. Faulty gear being substituted for spec materials, with the savings being skimmed off the top. Danny discovered the pattern, traced it back to specific suppliers. Harrison's voice carried the weight of decades spent assembling puzzle pieces. He was going to expose the whole network. Several studio executives, equipment manufacturers, even some union officials were involved. Sarah's professional mind engaged despite her emotional turmoil. That's not murder money. That's corruption, fraud maybe, but not worth killing over. It was in 1983. We're talking about hundreds of millions in contracts across the industry. But more importantly, Harrison paused, choosing his words carefully. 2 actors had already died using the faulty equipment. Danny wasn't just threatening to expose corruption. He was going to blow the whistle on what amounted to negligent homicide. The phone buzzed again. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward it, but Harrison caught her wrist. "Don't look. Whatever he's sending, it's designed to destabilize you. Fear makes people careless." But the damage was done. Even without reading the message, Sarah could feel the presence behind it. Someone watching, waiting, taking pleasure in their growing awareness of the trap being constructed around them. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked. "Years ago, when I was starting out. Why let me build a career in the same industry that killed my father?" Harrison released her wrist and turned toward the valley. This was the conversation he'd dreaded for 4 decades, the moment when his protection became a cage. Because keeping you safe meant keeping you ignorant. The moment you knew the truth, you became dangerous to them. As long as you were just Danny's daughter doing her job, following in his footsteps without questions, you were useful. A reminder that the system worked, that good people could still succeed. And now? Now you're Sarah Mackenzie, the safety coordinator who stood up to Tyler Brennan while Harrison Ford watched. You're the daughter of a dead whistleblower who has the most famous actor in Hollywood as her protector. Harrison's phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't resist checking it. The message contained a single photograph, Sarah's apartment building in Los Angeles, taken from across the street. Recent, judging by the evening light. Someone had been watching her home while she was working in Montana. Harrison showed her the screen. Sarah stared at the image of her own building, her mind struggling to process the violation. Her apartment, her sanctuary, her carefully constructed life, all of it had been under surveillance. "We need to get back to base camp," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "I need to call my crew, make sure everyone's safe. If this Volkov person is escalating—" Sarah Harrison's tone stopped her mid-sentence. "Your crew isn't the target. You are. And by extension, anyone who tries to protect you." He gestured toward the lights below. "Going back down there puts everyone at risk. Production assistants, grips, drivers, innocent people who don't know they're walking into a war zone." Another buzz, another message. "Tell Harrison that some promises can't be kept forever." The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. Volkov knew about the promise he'd made to Danny, the deathbed vow to protect Sarah no matter the cost. 40 years of careful distance, of professional boundaries maintained to keep her safe, and now it was all unraveling in real time. Sarah watched Harrison's expression change, saw something that looked like fear cross his weathered features. In that moment, she understood that whatever was coming would be worse than anything she could imagine. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the distant hum of generators from base camp below. Sarah stared at the phone's dark screen, her father's death reshaping itself in her mind from tragic accident to calculated murder. Every safety protocol she'd built her career on, every precaution that had made her reputation, all of it suddenly felt like elaborate theater, a performance designed to mask the truth that someone had executed Danny Mackenzie with mechanical precision. "The promise," she said quietly. "What exactly did you promise him?" Harrison's jaw tightened, the question he'd been avoiding for 40 years, the weight that had shaped every decision since that night in Moab when Danny lay dying in his arms. "That I'd keep you safe. That I'd make sure whoever killed him never got close to you." His voice carried the exhaustion of 4 decades spent honoring an impossible vow, that I'd find the truth, no matter how long it took, by staying away from me. Sarah's words weren't an accusation, but they cut deeper than any anger could have. By maintaining professional distance, by letting me think you barely remembered I existed. The phone buzzed. Harrison glanced down reflexively, his face going ashen. This time, the message contained an attachment, a video file, timestamp showing it was recorded less than an hour ago. He hesitated, then opened it. The footage was shaky, shot from inside a vehicle moving through the mountain roads below. The camera panned across the base camp, zooming in on specific trailers, lingering on the craft services area where crew members were grabbing late dinners. Then it focused on 2 figures walking up a mountain path, Sarah and Harrison, captured in telephoto clarity as they climbed toward their current position. "He's here," Harrison said, his voice barely audible. "Not watching remotely. Actually here, on location." Sarah leaned closer to see the screen. Watching herself being filmed without knowledge felt like a violation that went beyond surveillance. It was predatory, intimate in its intrusion. How long has he been watching? Probably since production started. Maybe longer. Harrison's thumb moved across the screen, forwarding the video to Frank Castellano with urgent priority. Marcus Volkov doesn't make mistakes. If he's revealing himself now, it means he's ready to finish what he started in 1983. Another message appeared. "She has Danny's eyes. Did you know that, Harrison?" The same expression he had right before the cable snapped. Confused, betrayed, wondering why his best friend couldn't save him. The words hit like physical blows. Sarah watched Harrison's composure crack, saw 40 years of controlled grief and carefully managed guilt rise to the surface. This wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about the failure that had haunted every day since Danny's death. "You blamed yourself," Sarah realized. "All this time you've been carrying the weight of not preventing it. I should have seen it coming." Harrison's admission came out raw, unfiltered. "Danny told me about the irregularities, showed me the evidence. I advised caution, told him to document everything before going to the authorities. I thought we had time." His hands clenched into fists. While I was being careful, they were rigging his equipment. The phone rang, Frank Castellano calling back. Harrison answered on speaker, his voice regaining its steadiness through force of will. "I watched the video," Frank said without preamble. "Volkov's not just on location, he's embedded. That footage was shot from inside the perimeter. He has access." "Crew member?" Sarah asked, her professional instincts engaging despite the personal chaos unraveling around her. "Or vendor, local hire, someone with legitimate access who's been planning this for months." Frank's breathing was labored. He was moving fast, probably already heading toward the airport. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. Don't trust anyone on that crew. Don't eat or drink anything you didn't prepare yourself. Don't go anywhere alone, especially not back to your trailer." "That's not sustainable," Sarah protested. "I have a job to do, equipment checks, safety briefings." "Your father had a job to do too," Frank interrupted. "Right up until someone sabotaged his rigging and made it look like equipment failure." The parallel was deliberate, designed to break through her professional denial. Sarah felt the last of her resistance crumble, replaced by the cold clarity that had kept the Mackenzie family alive in dangerous situations. Her father's death wasn't ancient history. It was prologue. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Harrison's phone buzzed one final time. The message was brief. "Production meeting tomorrow, 6 a.m. All department heads required." "Don't disappoint me, Sarah." The trap was closing. 40 years of patient hunting had led to this moment, a confrontation that would either end Marcus Volkov's decades-long game or claim the last member of the Mackenzie family. As Sarah stared at the message, she understood that her father's murder was about to become her inheritance. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. Somewhere in the darkness below, a killer was preparing for tomorrow's final act. The message glowed on Harrison's phone screen like a challenge issued across 4 decades of silence. Sarah stared at it, her mind racing through the implications. A production meeting called by someone who shouldn't have the authority to call one. Someone who was supposed to be dead history, not present danger. "We need to go down," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I have to check the equipment. If he's been here for months, if he has access—" "Absolutely not." Harrison's response was immediate, protective instincts overriding tactical thinking. It's exactly what he wants, you isolated, vulnerable, following predictable patterns. Sarah turned to face him fully, and for a moment, Harrison saw Danny Mackenzie in the set of her shoulders, the determined tilt of her chin. "You don't understand. The equipment I inspected today for tomorrow's sequence, if he's been planning this, if he has access." Her voice cracked slightly. "Harrison, what if I already signed off on faulty gear? What if I'm about to become complicit in someone else's death?" The possibility hit Harrison like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on protecting Sarah that he hadn't considered the deeper game, that Volkov might use her expertise against her, turn Danny's daughter into an unwitting accomplice to the very crime that had destroyed her family. Harrison's phone rang. Not a buzz, not a text, a call from an unknown number. He answered it, his finger hovering over the speaker button before deciding against it. Harrison. The voice that came through the earpiece was cultured, European accented, carrying the weight of age and satisfaction. "After all these years, it's good to hear your voice." Harrison's response was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his posture, the way his free hand clenched unconsciously. "I imagine you're concerned about the equipment inspection." Sarah did excellent work today, so thorough, so professional. Just like her father. There was a pause, the silence heavy with implication. "Did you know she approved the same rigging system that killed Danny? Identical specifications, same manufacturer. Poetry, really." Sarah's face went white. She lunged for the phone, but Harrison stepped back, his eyes locked on hers as he listened to words that were reshaping everything she thought she knew about the day's work. "Of course, the equipment itself is perfectly safe," Volkov continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "I'm not my predecessors, Harrison. I don't kill through incompetence. When I decide someone needs to die, I do it properly. What do you want?" Harrison's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "Justice, resolution, an end to this tedious game we've been playing." Volkov's tone shifted, becoming sharper. "You've spent 40 years hunting shadows, Harrison, building elaborate theories about conspiracies and cover-ups, but you never understood the truth, did you?" Sarah watched Harrison's expression change, confusion replacing certainty. 40 years of investigation, of careful fact-gathering and methodical pursuit suddenly felt less solid. "Danny wasn't killed because he discovered corruption," Volkov said, his words falling like hammer blows. "He was killed because he was stealing from it. Your best friend, your noble whistleblower, was skimming money from safety equipment contracts and selling the information to competitors. When he got greedy, when he threatened to expose the whole network unless his cut increased," the pause was calculated, devastating. "Well, thieves who become blackmailers rarely live long." "You're lying." But Harrison's voice lacked conviction. Pieces of the puzzle he'd never been able to fit. Danny's expensive new truck, the gambling debts that had mysteriously disappeared, his reluctance to involve authorities immediately, suddenly clicked into place with horrible clarity. Sarah grabbed the phone from Harrison's hand and pressed speaker. "If that's true, why wait 40 years to tell us? Why the threats? Why the surveillance?" Volkov's laugh was genuinely amused. "Because, my dear Sarah, Harrison has been protecting the wrong person. All these years of keeping you safe, of maintaining distance to shield you from danger." Another pause, longer this time. "He should have been protecting you from himself." The words hung in the mountain air like poison. Sarah looked at Harrison, saw something crumbling behind his eyes, not just the image of Danny Mackenzie, but his own identity as protector, as keeper of justice. "What does that mean?" she demanded. "It means," Volkov said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a trap finally sprung, that Harrison Ford has been lying to you about more than just your father's death. Ask him who really called in the safety violation that killed Danny. Ask him who provided the evidence that led to the rigging inspection. Ask him who had the access and the motivation to ensure that your father's equipment would fail at exactly the right moment. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. She stared at Harrison, seeing 40 years of guilt and protection in a new, terrible light. Ask him, Sarah. Ask your father's best friend why he's really spent 4 decades keeping you close. The phone went dead in Sarah's trembling hands, leaving only the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant hum of generators far below. Harrison stood motionless, his weathered face a mask of devastation that 40 years of Hollywood training couldn't hide. The accusation hung between them like a blade suspended by the thinnest thread. "Did you?" Sarah's voice barely broke the silence. "Did you call in that safety violation?" Harrison's eyes closed, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted. The protective facade, the careful distance he'd maintained for decades, all of it crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. Yes. The word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything that came after. Sarah stepped backward involuntarily, her father's death reorganizing itself once again in her mind. Not accident, not murder by strangers, but betrayal by the man she'd trusted most. Not for the reasons he's suggesting," Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength even as his world collapsed. Danny was stealing, yes, skimming from equipment budgets, taking bribes to approve substandard gear. But Sarah... He reached toward her, then let his hand drop when she flinched away. He wasn't planning to expose anyone. He was planning to run. The mountain air felt suddenly thin, insufficient. Sarah struggled to process the cascade of revelations, each one contradicting everything she'd believed about her father, about Harrison, about the foundation her entire life had been built upon. "I called in the safety violation because I thought it would save his life," Harrison pressed on, desperation creeping into his voice. "I thought if production shut down, if there was an investigation, it would give me time to convince him to come forward, to make it right. I never imagined they'd what?" Sarah's professional mind engaged despite her emotional turmoil. "If the equipment was compromised, if you knew it was dangerous." The equipment wasn't supposed to fail. Harrison's confession came out in a rush of words he'd held back for 4 decades. The safety violation was administrative. Paperwork discrepancies, certification dates. It should have delayed filming for a day, maybe 2. But someone used my report as cover for real sabotage. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again. The story kept changing, truth and lies twisting together until she couldn't separate them. "So you did get my father killed, just not intentionally." "Yes." Harrison's admission was barely audible. "And I've spent 40 years trying to find out who used my investigation as a murder weapon. Because someone knew I was going to file that report. Someone was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to act." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Harrison's decades-long investigation hadn't been about finding Danny's killer. It had been about finding his own unwitting accomplice. Every lead he'd followed, every connection he'd traced, had been an attempt to understand how his effort to save Danny had become the instrument of his destruction. "Volkov," Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her. "He knew you were going to file the report because he was watching you watch Danny." Harrison nodded, the weight of recognition settling over his features. "I thought I was being careful, thorough, but I was being herded, guided toward exactly the action they needed to make their move." Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, a new message from an unknown number. With shaking hands, she pulled it out and read, "Now you understand why Harrison could never let you get too close. Guilt makes people do terrible things to the ones they love. He's still watching," she said, showing Harrison the screen. "Still listening somehow." Harrison studied their surroundings with new awareness. The isolated ridge, the perfect vantage point overlooking the base camp, the illusion of privacy, all of it suddenly felt orchestrated. They weren't having a private conversation. They were performing in a theater where the audience had been choosing the script for 40 years. "We need to move," Harrison said, professional instincts overriding emotional chaos. "If he wanted us to have this conversation here, now it means he's ready for the next phase." But Sarah didn't move. Instead, she stared down at the lights below, her mind working through possibilities with the methodical precision that had made her reputation. The production meeting tomorrow. He called it, but he's not officially part of the crew, which means he's been using someone else's authority, Harrison finished. Someone with the power to make that kind of demand. The realization hit them simultaneously. Marcus Volkov wasn't hiding among the crew. He was hiding behind someone in authority, using their position to orchestrate events while remaining invisible. Tomorrow's meeting wasn't just a trap. It was a grand finale 40 years in the making. As they started down the mountain path, Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. 6 a.m. sharp, Sarah. Don't keep your father waiting. The words stopped her cold. In the darkness behind them, something moved. A shadow that had been watching, waiting, preparing to finish what had begun with Danny Mackenzie's death in 1983. Harrison spun toward the shadow, 40 years of buried instincts erupting to the surface. But Sarah was faster, her hand already on his arm, pulling him down the path with professional urgency that overrode his protective impulses. "Not here," she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of tactical clarity that would have made Danny proud. "If we confront him now, in the dark, on his terms, we lose everything." They moved down the mountain path in controlled silence, each step deliberate despite the adrenaline coursing through their systems. Harrison's mind raced through possibilities. 40 years of careful investigation condensing into immediate tactical decisions. Behind them, the shadow followed at a distance, not hiding anymore, but not quite revealing itself either. "The production meeting," Sarah said as they reached the tree line. "He's not calling it to expose us. He's calling it to end us, publicly, in front of witnesses who can't ignore what they see." Harrison understood immediately. Marcus Volkov had spent 4 decades orchestrating this moment. Not just revenge for Danny's betrayal, but a masterpiece of psychological destruction. Force Harrison to confess his role in Danny's death in front of the entire crew, destroy his reputation and legacy, then eliminate Sarah as the final witness to the original crime. "He made one mistake," Harrison said, his voice regaining its steady authority. "He told us the truth about Danny." Sarah looked at him sharply. "How is that a mistake?" "Because now I know what really happened that day. And more importantly," Harrison pulled out his phone, scrolling through 40 years of carefully documented evidence, "I know who else was involved." The base camp lights grew larger as they descended, and with them came the sounds of a film crew winding down for the night. Normal conversations about call times and equipment checks, the mundane details that kept a production running. But underneath it all, Harrison now heard something different, the careful orchestration of people who'd been playing roles for months. "The assistant director who approved the schedule changes," Harrison said, pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. "The transportation coordinator who arranged the location access. The local hire who's been handling security." He stopped walking, forcing Sarah to turn back toward him. "Sarah, how many people on this crew did you actually hire yourself?" Her face went pale as she considered the implications. "Maybe half. The rest came through recommendations, referrals from people I trusted. People Volkov's been cultivating for 40 years. Harrison's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Frank Castellano. He answered immediately, putting it on speaker. "Harrison, you need to get Sarah off that mountain now." Frank's voice was tight with urgency. "I've been digging into the crew manifest. At least 6 people have connections to shell companies linked to the original conspiracy. This isn't just about you and Sarah. They're planning to stage another accident that takes out multiple witnesses." Sarah's professional instincts kicked in. The morning sequence, the helicopter work, the practical effects. If they've compromised multiple safety systems. "It won't be an accident this time," Harrison said, understanding flooding through him. "It'll be a massacre designed to look like negligence. And with Sarah dead, with me discredited and possibly eliminated, the truth about 1983 dies with us." Frank's voice crackled through the phone. "I'm 30 minutes out by helicopter, but I can't extract you from the location without causing a scene that tips them off." "Good," Harrison said, his decision crystallizing with the kind of clarity that had driven 40 years of investigation. "Because we're not running." Sarah stared at him, "Harrison, these people killed my father and have been planning to kill us for months. This isn't a movie." "No, it's better than a movie." Harrison's voice carried a confidence she hadn't heard before, the sound of a man who'd finally stopped running from his guilt and started using it as fuel. "It's justice. And unlike 40 years ago, this time we're not walking into their trap blind." He turned toward the base camp, his posture shifting from defensive to predatory. Volkov wants a production meeting? He wants to stage a finale in front of witnesses? Then that's exactly what he'll get. Sarah grabbed his arm. "What are you planning?" Harrison's smile was sharp, carrying 4 decades of suppressed rage and carefully focused purpose. "I'm planning to give the performance of my lifetime, and when it's over, everyone will know exactly who killed Danny Mackenzie and why." The base camp sprawled before them, lights casting long shadows between trailers and equipment trucks. Somewhere in that maze of ordinary film industry chaos, Marcus Volkov was preparing for tomorrow's carefully orchestrated conclusion. But Harrison Ford, actor, investigator, and Danny Mackenzie's guilt-ridden best friend, was done being a pawn in someone else's story. Tomorrow's production meeting would indeed be a finale, but not the one Volkov had spent 40 years planning. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and approaching dawn as they descended toward the lights below, where 4 decades of secrets waited to be exposed. The Montana dawn broke with deceptive serenity, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold that reminded Harrison of 100 other location shoots from a career that now felt like someone else's life. He stood outside his trailer, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the controlled chaos of a film crew preparing for what most of them believed would be another day of routine production work. But Harrison Ford knew better. At 78, after 40 years of carrying Danny Mackenzie's death like a stone in his chest, he finally understood the weight of truth. Not the sanitized version he'd constructed to survive his guilt, but the messy, complicated reality that had shaped every decision since 1983. 5 minutes to the production meeting, Sarah appeared beside him, her face carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night reconciling the father she'd idealized with the flawed man who'd actually existed. "Are you ready for this?" Harrison studied her profile, seeing Danny in the set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders when facing something difficult. "I've been ready for 40 years. I just didn't know it." The meeting was called in the main equipment tent, ostensibly to address safety concerns before the day's helicopter sequence. As the crew filed in, grips and gaffers, camera operators and script supervisors, Harrison counted the faces Frank Castellano had identified as compromised. 6 people who'd spent months integrating themselves into the production, earning trust, positioning themselves for today's carefully orchestrated finale. Marcus Volkov entered last, no longer hiding behind intermediaries or shadows. He was smaller than Harrison had imagined, a man in his 70s whose European accent carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When their eyes met across the assembled crew, Harrison felt the strange satisfaction of finally seeing his opponent clearly after decades of chasing ghosts. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," Volkov began, his tone perfectly calibrated for concerned professionalism. "Recent safety inspections have raised questions that require immediate attention before we proceed with today's aerial work." Harrison let him speak, let him build toward the revelation that would destroy reputations and eliminate witnesses. But as Volkov's carefully prepared narrative unfolded, Harrison began to understand something that 40 years of investigation had missed. The man standing before them wasn't the architect of Danny Mackenzie's murder. He was its inheritor, someone who'd built a career on cleaning up the loose ends that others had created. "Mr. Ford," Volkov turned toward him with practiced timing, "I believe you have something you'd like to share with everyone about the 1983 incident that killed Daniel Mackenzie." The tent fell silent, 60 people holding their breath, waiting for the confession that would shatter one of Hollywood's most enduring reputations. Harrison stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and made a choice that surprised even himself. "You're right," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the tent. "I do have something to share, but not what you're expecting." Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder, 4 decades of investigation, documentation, and carefully preserved evidence. Danny Mackenzie was stealing money from safety equipment contracts. I reported safety violations to force a production shutdown, hoping to save his life and give him a chance to make things right. Instead, my report was used as cover for murder. The admission rippled through the assembled crew like a physical force. But Harrison wasn't finished. What Mr. Volkov didn't tell you is that I've spent 40 years documenting every person connected to that conspiracy. Every shell company, every forged safety certificate, every payoff that bought silence. Harrison's eyes found each of the compromised crew members in turn, including the 6 people in this room who've been positioning themselves to stage another accident that would eliminate the witnesses to the original crime. Frank Castellano's voice crackled through concealed speakers. Harrison's insurance policy, broadcast from a helicopter circling overhead. FBI agents are currently surrounding this location. Nobody moves until we sort out who's who. The careful choreography of Volkov's plan collapsed into chaos. Some crew members demanded explanations. Others moved toward the exits only to find them blocked. But Harrison's attention was fixed on Sarah, who stood beside the equipment displays her father had once inspected with such fatal thoroughness. "I can't give you the father you thought you had," Harrison said to her, his voice cutting through the confusion around them. "And I can't undo the choice that got him killed. But I can give you the truth, finally and completely." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, not for the loss of her illusions, but for the recognition that love and betrayal could exist in the same gesture, that 40 years of guilt could transform into something approaching redemption. As federal agents flooded into the tent and Marcus Volkov was led away in restraints, Harrison Ford felt something he hadn't experienced since 1983, the possibility of peace. Not the clean resolution that movies promised, but the earned sadness of a man who'd finally stopped running from the consequences of trying to save someone he loved. The Montana wind still carried the scent of pine and possibility, but now it felt like forgiveness.